Welcome to today's webinar titled Ethical Considerations in Scholarly Publishing, conducted in collaboration with the Taylor and Francis Group, world's leading publishers of peer-reviewed journals, books, ebooks, and scholarly resources. This insightful webinar will help researchers overcome sensitive and challenging ethical dilemmas in scholarly publishing. Today we have with us Professor Richard de Gries and Dr. Sabina Alam, who will conduct this informative session. Professor de Gries is an internationally acclaimed astrophysicist, editor, publishing consultant, and public speaker with a diverse academic profile. He has driven several projects at renowned institutions and is currently appointed at Macquarie University, Australia, as an associate dean and professor. To date, he has over 3,000 publications in top-tier journals and 6 published books to his name. The impact of his work is demonstrated by over 5,000 citations that he has to his credit. He is also the recipient of more than 25 research grants. Additionally, he is a peer reviewer for many leading physics and astronomy journals, including Nature, Science, etc. In today's session, he will discuss major ethical issues and share the best practices and tips to ensure compliance with recommended ethical guidelines. Dr. Alam is the Director of Publishing Ethics and Integrity at the Taylor and Francis Group. In her current role, she leads the Publishing Ethics and Integrity team on providing expert advice and support on ethical, research integrity, and policy matters to minimize risk and ensure compliance to the highest publication ethics standards. Before joining the Taylor and Francis Group, Dr. Alam was associated with the BMC Medicine at Biomed Central and F1000 platforms. In today's session, she will present a publisher's perspective while discussing publication ethics, the most common types of ethical issues encountered, and post-publication changes. We welcome and thank you both for joining in today. Before I hand over the mic to Professor de Gries, I'd like to give you all a brief introduction about Enago. We are the world's leading author services provider, and our author-first, quality-first approach ensures that our authors receive only the best quality output and excellent user experiences at all times. This unrelenting focus on authors' needs means that we never compromise on our quality systems and processes at any cost. All our services are designed keeping in mind the author's needs. Enago Academy is our author training platform that educates authors through a number of resources, including webinars as well as live workshop sessions. We also have an e-learning platform for researchers called Enago Learn, along with a one-on-one consultation platform called as Enago Consult. Enago offers world-class services to researchers at different stages of their research career, such as two-editor system English language editing service, academic and non-academic translation service, manuscript preparation service, and publication support service. The Enago promise guarantees that a manuscript edited by us will never be rejected on the basis of poor language. On a rare occasion, if rejection occurs, we will take full responsibility for re-editing the paper for resubmission at no additional cost. Enago's comprehensive after-sales services will support you at every step of the way until your manuscript is published. They are designed to take care of every need from the time you receive our main services until you are published. Enago's research communication services are designed to help you effectively present your research data. In case you are interested in any of these services, feel free to email to us at academy@enago.com. Now, without any further delay, I hand over the mic to Professor Digris.
Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Greetings from Sydney, Australia, where the local time is 10:36 p.m. I'm glad there are so many people here today, and we'll be doing our best to get you up to speed with research ethics. I said we start with the principles of research ethics, and they are shown here in these little colored bubbles. We started with honesty and objectivity. We honestly report our data, our methods, our results, and our publication. We do this objectively without changing data in a way that's not warranted, no falsification, no fabrication, no misrepresentation. We have to do this carefully. As scientists, we always have to be as careful as possible, and so avoid careless errors and negligence. Carefully and critically examine your own work and that of your peers. Do it with integrity, keep your promises and agreements, and be sincere, be consistent in your thoughts and actions. In addition to that, of course, you see there, we have to act within the law. We should do this as openly as possible, particularly in the current era that we are talking about open source software, open data, open publication, to share data, results, etc., with our peers, so that together we can actually do more with the data that you may have obtained for your own research project. And we do this in a socially responsible manner to promote social good and prevent or mitigate social harm through research, public education, and advocacy. Next, please. Yes, thanks. So the the domain of research ethics has an enormously broad scope, and you can see there are some main pillars here. Research ethics deals with the analysis of ethical issues that could arise with every new technology that comes up, for instance, stem cell technology or genome editing. Apart from that, a research study must be conducted and the results analyzed following the principles of research ethics. Researchers must ethically report research and adhere to a set of publication ethics. And we will cover some of the common violations that occur in the literature and in the scientific field over the course of today's presentation. Next, please. As early career researchers, PhD students, and perhaps first postdocs, you might wonder why we're talking about unethical practices and research ethics, because you may not have encountered the enormous pressure that many of the international researchers are under in terms of publishing papers to make career advancements and career progress. That's the culture of publish or perish. We have to publish papers, as many papers as possible, in journals that are of the highest possible quality, in order to be able to advance our careers to the next stage or get awards, etc. In some countries, you get part of your salary from publishing papers, which there are some ethical issues there as well, which we can talk about later if you're interested. Journals must also are also under pressure to publish a lot of papers of good quality, because every year many new journals pop up around the world, and so there is a lot of competition for space in journals, particularly in the better journals. So the journals also must act with integrity, and that sometimes doesn't always work. We'll talk about that as well. And then research institutions around the world, of course, want to attract the best possible researchers, the best talents, the highest profile professors and junior researchers. And in order to be attractive places to move to, these institutions must have a track record of doing good research, and a track record is these days usually seen in terms of publishing good papers, lots of good papers in good journals. So this excessive pressure to publish threatens the academic research integrity, and so we have to be very careful that we adhere to research ethics to avoid falling into that trap. Next, please. So there are, it's not a victimless crime to be unethical. There are a number of consequences of the pressure to publish, and they may have devastating consequences for your own career or the careers of people around you. We see 5 different aspects of unethical practices here. Multiplication of authorship is one of them. We will talk a little bit later about the authorship criteria most journals adhere to, in the sense that there are a certain set of rules that you have to abide by in order to be called an author. And you cannot just be an author because you're the friend of the first author. The consequences of the pressure to publish include also that the research integrity could be compromised. Citations in journals and 2 other journals may no longer represent the true impact of a paper, because journals or authors try to game the numbers of citations. These are called citation cartels. Some people publish what we call the least publishable units, and that means that they have a data set and they try to publish as many papers as they can based on that single data set. Each of these papers on their own is not that interesting scientifically, but the whole set together would be interesting. And so this is called salami slicing, which is also considered unethical. And then the final ball there says publication bias, which in essence means that if you get results that you don't like, you don't publish them, but you only publish the results that you do like. And again, that skews the scientific records. Next, please. And I'll slow down a little bit. The academic publishing landscape, as you can see here, is quite a complex ecosystem involving a lot of different actors. It's not just the researcher. The researcher is there at number 1, but the researcher works for a university or a research institute. The researcher might hopefully get funding from a funding agency or deal with policymakers in government. And so there is quite a complex interaction going there. Once they've done their research and they would like to write it up for a more general audience to be aware of, they have to write their papers. The publishers are involved there in publishing the journals they write them in, and eventually the institutional libraries will take care of the permanent record. So it's quite a complex ecosystem involving at least 5 different actors, and every single one of them has to act in an ethical manner. Next, please. For any scientific publication, it is the author's responsibility to ensure that 3 main tenets of scientific publication are upheld, and you can see them here: authenticity, accuracy, and originality. Researchers should conduct their research from research proposal to publication in line with best practices and codes of conduct. An author's central obligation is to present an accurate and complete account of the research performed, absolutely avoiding deception, including the data collected or used, as well as an objective discussion of the significance of the research. The research report and the data collected should contain sufficient detail and references to public sources of information to permit a trained professional to reproduce the experimental observations. So that's the authenticity aspect of scientific publishing. As regards to accuracy, the accuracy and originality of the content is important to establish the scientific novelty of the study. Most of the better journals are only interested in publishing high impact results, which tend to be results that are novel, that have not been done before, that are not incremental. Publication or research fraud is publishing data or conclusions that were not generated by experiments, but by manipulation of data, falsification, fabrication, or misrepresentation. And then finally, as regards originality, authors need to ensure that their paper is based on original, that means never before published, research. Duplication of publication is therefore considered ethically wrong, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. So there is a lot of pressure on the shoulders of the researcher to act ethically, but here are the reasons why. We want to keep the publication record and the scientific record, the scholarly record, as clean as possible so that it is as useful as possible to the wider community. Next please. And so, based on what I just described on the previous slide, you've you will figure out that authors have lots of duties. Now, this looks like a lot, and it is a lot, but it's actually quite natural to, if you act ethically, to follow all these guidelines. First of all, we should strictly follow authorship guidelines, and we'll talk about authorship guidelines in just a moment. Maintain originality and acknowledge all of your sources. It's always better to add that extra reference than not adding that reference, because it's always better to show where you've got your ideas from and properly acknowledge the source that the idea came from. Authors need to notify fundamental errors to the editor if they find them even after publishing. You may need to ask for a correction or even a retraction of your paper. Very importantly, authors need to maintain reporting standards and image integrity. We'll talk about image manipulation in just a moment. Similarly, maintain clinical trial transparency if you're in the medical field. Very importantly, declare any competing interests, and these could be commercial or these could be personal. Again, we'll get back to those in just a few slides. Authors will need to provide access to the data and retain those data for future reference. That's for reviewers. That's also for other people to double check your results at a later stage. At the moment, the scientific field is plagued by what's called the reproducibility crisis. It's often very difficult to reproduce previously obtained results. So it's good to be able to compare with the actual record that's out there. Don't participate in redundant or simultaneous publications submitted to multiple journals at the same time, pretty much covering the same narrative. And authors should declare hazardous issues and comply with human and animal rights laws and guidelines. So that's a legal aspect. Next slide, please. It's not just the authors who have duties. The editors of journals have duties as well. Again, they need to declare any competing interests. I have been an editor of some of the main journals in my field of astrophysics for many years. Sometimes the editor-in-chief or one of the other editors submits an article for publication in our journal, and we make absolutely sure that the editors themselves do not get to see the record of that paper, so they're not involved in choosing the peer reviewers or in making decisions about their own papers. That's in essence a matter of declaring competing interests. Editors should ensure fair play in peer review and publication decisions, so be objective and don't be led by personal gain or things like that. They should be vigilant regarding the publication record, make sure that unethical papers don't slip through the mazes, and they should not tamper with journal metrics, so they should not tell authors, please add a few more references to my journal. And you might think, well, does that ever happen? I have seen it quite a few times in my career that I've been asked, or some of my students have been asked, to add references to articles in a particular journal. Needless to say, we're no longer publishing in that particular journal. Next slide, please. And then after you submit your paper to a journal and the editor thinks it has merit, he or she will most likely send it out for review to a number of reviewers, and these reviewers have similarly a number of obligations. They should not write one-line reviews saying this paper is absolutely fantastic, it should be published. That is useless for the editor because we don't know if that's a genuine assessment. You should also not write a report saying this is the worst paper I've ever read, reject, because we don't know why. So write a reasonable report explaining your reasoning and your recommendations, and try to be positive, constructive, in order to help the authors improve their paper, and possibly for the particular journal you are reviewing for, or for another journal in case this particular journal has decided to reject that paper. Very importantly, reviewers should maintain confidentiality. If you're a student, your supervisor may have asked you on occasion to review a paper. That is frowned upon, but it happens. In that case, the supervisor should have talked to the editor and received the agreement from the editor to do so, because there's a there's an issue of confidentiality here. Reviewers particularly should also be alert to ethical issues. It's not always easy because the reviewers do not necessarily have access to the raw data that you used for your paper. And as I said already, reviewers need to be objective and declare any competing interests. Next slide, please. And then the publisher is not out of the woods. They are also responsible as an actor in this complex ecosystem of publication. They are the guardians of the scholarly record. They have to safeguard, ensure editorial independence, ideally. They often collaborate, different publishers. They are competing, of course, commercially, many of them, but they also collaborate to set industry best practices. They provide editors certainly with technical support, and in case of legal wrangling, also most of the time with legal support. And they tend to educate researchers on publication ethics. That's what we're doing today. Next slide, please. Right, so now that we've heard about our duties as actors in this complex ecosystem of research, let's talk about research misconduct in some more detail. So in the next slide, we see a funny graph that shows you as a function of year from 1997 until sometime after 2015, the volume of papers that have been retracted for one reason or another from the scholarly literature. And in blue here, these are reasons why papers have been retracted, and there was nothing wrong with the ethics of those retractions. It was just perhaps errors or mistakes that were stupid, and the authors decided that they couldn't fix the mistakes and asked the editors to retract, or the journal to retract their papers. However, very worryingly, the bottom part of this inverted iceberg, in red, or in different shades of red and orange, is the volume of papers retracted based on various types of fraud. And so what we mean by that is it could be fabrication of data, falsification of data, or plagiarism. And we'll talk about plagiarism in just a moment. Other types of misconduct, that's the lighter shade of orange there, could be fake peer review. If you've not heard of this before, you might be very surprised that some unethical researchers even manage to fool journal editors by organizing their own fake peer reviews using email addresses that they set up themselves. We'll talk about that at the very end of today's presentation. Next slide, please. So here are some examples of misconduct during the process of conducting research. Research misconduct generally does not include unintentional errors, but it's intentional misrepresentation of data, research data, processes, and/or findings. And you can see a few here, right? We have inappropriate design that will lead to biased results a priori, distortion of design, carelessness or incompetence. We talked about that before. We have to be as careful as possible to become a good researcher. Fabrication of data, not following protocols for safety or informed consent, not obtaining IRB, Institutional Review Board approval prior to starting the study. That's when it involves humans or animals. Next slide, please. During the analysis of your research, you've done the research, you've obtained your data. Misconduct that could take place involves falsification of data, improper analysis, multiple comparisons not reported or adjusted. So that's again misrepresentation or falsification of data, misrepresentation of statistical methods or an analysis, post hoc analyses not identified, or inappropriate exclusion of outliers. Now, many of you will have heard of p-hacking. P-hacking is an inappropriate statistical method that where people try to make their results statistically significant by varying the data such that the level of significance just gets above that minimum p level. But statisticians in general advise that using p-values as such is not a good idea, and p-hacking is considered unethical. Similarly, the very last point here, inappropriate exclusion of outliers. If you look at a swarm of data points, often people take a median or a mean, and they obtain an appropriate uncertainty range, and then sometimes they might decide to remove certain outliers based on analysis of the uncertainty ranges. That's fine, but simply taking out data points because you don't like them, that is an inappropriate way of excluding outliers. Next slide, please. And then during the reporting, during the writing up of your analysis in a paper, possible misconduct could include selective reporting. That's in essence what we call publication bias. We don't report everything we find, we only report the results that we like. Failure to publish or agreement not to publish of a certain part of the data, over-interpretation of results. That happens a lot actually, and I see articles also as reviewer, and I often comment and say, well, maybe you see a little bit too much in the data, and that's maybe not quite warranted. Undisclosed shortcomings of the study, duplicate or nearly identical publications, we'll talk about that in just a moment. Conflict of interest, we talked about already, and we'll talk about a bit more, and then the failure to provide the raw data. Many journals these days ask you to provide access to the raw data if someone wants to have access to the raw data. In my field, in astrophysics, most of our data is publicly available, although a number of data sets are private, and I have to admit it's sometimes very difficult to get access to private data, despite journal policies that the raw data have to be made available. So there's a bit of tension there in the community as well. Next slide, please. Misconduct can have severe implications for yourself and for your peers. It can damage your career. You could lose your PhD. You could lose your job. You could even go to jail. That happens very occasionally. In some countries, serious misconduct can even lead to very serious sentences. In China, if you commit research misconduct, that eventually leads to medicines that are faulty and cause patients to die, you might even get the death penalty. Now, that is really quite extreme, but the point here is that it can damage your career and your life. So there are all kinds of good reasons to actually act as ethically as possible. And not only your own career, but also that of your collaborators. Because if you've published a paper that eventually has to be retracted because of research misconduct, that stains your own name, but also the name of your co-authors. And so that has far-reaching consequences. In addition, it damages the reputation of the institution where the research was conducted unethically. It's a waste of time, effort, and funds. The funds could have been used, and the time could have been used better to do proper research. And it misguides the design of the next steps. What's your next research project? If it's based on faulty research, then the next steps will also most likely be faulty. Next, please. The most common types of research misconduct, as we mentioned already, include fabrication of data, falsification and manipulation of materials, and plagiarism. Plagiarism is using someone else's research processes, results, or words without giving due credit, without referencing, in essence. Next slide, please. So let's look at these three aspects in turn. We'll start with data fabrication and falsification. Research misconduct in the form of these actions can have serious consequences. Making up data or results to make the study more novel. How do we get into Nature? By having a very novel study, but don't make it novel by fabricating data. Just do it based on data integrity. Don't add false references to fake the authenticity of your document and of the argument in your manuscript. Next one, please. One of the most important aspects that plays a role here, and that happens a lot in the biological and medical sciences, is an issue related to image manipulation. You have lots of images, microscope images, etc. And it's not always clear to junior researchers what can and cannot be done with those images. It is okay to improve the clarity of your image, but not to enhance or obscure the results. It is okay to adjust the brightness, the contrast, or the color balance, but any changes should not obscure, eliminate, or misrepresent the original data. You can put figures together into an arrangement, but each image has to be clear. It has to abide by the first two tick marks there. Next, please. Data manipulation is a big no-no. Don't deliberately or even unintentionally manipulate data to fit your hypothesis. You may have an hypothesis when you start out your research. If you didn't get your data and it doesn't quite fit, the data don't quite fit your hypothesis, don't feel tempted to change the data so that you meet your hypothesis. Think of another way of another scenario that might explain your data. Don't omit important facts to obtain the results that you're after. It's the data that should tell you the story, and the data should not be massaged into the results that you really want, because that's not science, that's manipulation. Next, please. Now we get a series of slides on plagiarism. Plagiarism is one of the most common occurrences of misconduct in research papers. It is the unethical practice of using someone else's work or ideas. It could be done on purpose, but it could also be completely accidentally as your own, without the permission of the original authors or without acknowledging their contributions. The most blatant form of plagiarism is simply copying or paraphrasing words or ideas from someone else without attribution. But actually, that same thing applies to you using your own text from a previous paper. In principle, you should not copy and paste text from a previous paper that you wrote yourself into a new paper for a number of reasons. It's called self-plagiarism, but it might, well, first of all, it's not new anymore, so that is duplication of efforts. But also it might land you in hot water legally, because there's a good chance that for your first paper from which you actually took the relevant text, you transfer the copyright to the publisher. So you're actually no longer the copyright holder. That's another reason, for instance. Plagiarism is a serious offense with potentially severe repercussions. I already mentioned job losses, loss of reputation, losing your PhD, or article retractions. Article retractions as such are not necessarily a problem if you retract them for the right reasons. Like you've made a mistake and you found the mistake and you couldn't fix it. That's fine. That is you being a careful scientist asking for the record to be amended. Retracting it because you have committed plagiarism, that will leave a bad stain on your reputation. If you want to literally include text from previous papers, it says here, ask for permission if necessary, or actually put your text in between double quotes so people can see it's a direct text, and include a reference to that previous publication. Next slide, please. There are a number of different types of plagiarism. There is the direct plagiarism we talked about already, the word-for-word copying without attribution. We talked about self-plagiarism, unacknowledged reuse of your own work. But then we have mosaic plagiarism. That's where you use phrases and ideas from a whole bunch of different papers, put them together in the order that fits your paper best, and make them your own without attribution as well, poorly paraphrased content. And then there is the theme of accidental plagiarism. Sometimes it happens that you've been reading a lot of papers, you put it all together in your head, you write it up, but actually some of the ideas were not your own, but you forget to cite them. That's accidental plagiarism, should not be done either. If you're caught out, and you might be caught out by a reviewer, you have to fix it. Next one, please. Most journals will, once you have submitted your paper to the journal and the editor has decided that it's good enough to go out for peer review, most journals will pass your submission through one of their plagiarism checking software suites. And well, the simplest way that you can do yourself is you copy and paste some text into Google and search if you can find that text elsewhere. To my surprise, a number of years ago, this was a paper by an undergraduate student I had to assess. I found that she wrote relatively poorly, and then suddenly there were whole areas of text that looked wonderful, very good phrasing, very good text, and that made me a bit suspicious because the quality of the text varied so wildly. So I actually copied and pasted a part of her work into Google, and I found that 80% of that particular paper had been plagiarized. Needless to say, we did not proceed to submitting that paper to a journal, but it had to be fixed completely. Journals tend to pay for plagiarism checking software, and there are a few here at the bottom of the slide. Plagiarism Checker X, Authenticate, and Turnitin. Turnitin is often used by universities. Universities tend to have subscriptions, so you may want to ask your supervisor, if you're a junior scientist, to get access if you'd like to check out whether your work has a lot of overlap or similarity with previous work, because that's what these tools do. They don't actually tell you whether or not something is plagiarized, but they tell you what the level is of the similarity with previous work. Now, pretty much all papers submitted to journals will have some level of similarity to previous work, because there are only so many ways in which you can say certain things elegantly in English or even in other languages as well. And so journal editors are normally not so bothered if your level of similarity is up to about 20%. That's not a hard and fast rule, but of course, the higher the level is, the more the editors will actually scrutinize your submission to see where that similarity occurs. If it occurs in the methods, that's usually not so serious, because again, there are only so many ways in which you can describe methods, particularly if it's a standard setup. But if it occurs in the discussion and the analysis sections, that is a worry, because that means you have taken too much text from previous publications, and you have to fix that. Next one, please. Contribution in any way to a research study or manuscript needs to be acknowledged in the form of either authorship, that's the left hand arrow, or contributorship. If you are not an author but a contributor, your contributions should be acknowledged in the acknowledgement section of your paper. So let's discuss these in detail over the next few slides. Next one, please. Now, this is a busy slide, and this is the bottom line of how you should decide, ideally, how to attribute authorship on a paper that you're involved in. These are guidelines set by the International Council of Medical Journal Editors, but they apply much more broadly than just to medical research. There are 4 aspects here. One should have had significant contributions to the conception or design of the research idea. You should have been involved in drafting the work or revising it critically for crucial intellectual content. That's an important keyword, intellectual content. You should have been involved in the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data for the project. Again, that's hands-on analysis or data acquisition. And you should have agreed to the final version of the paper to be published. And then after publication, you should agree that you can be held accountable for all of the aspects of the work in the paper. So that's actually quite a burden, and that's quite a serious duty on the authors. All authors share responsibility and accountability for the final published paper. This is very important. There are some issues there, and we'll talk about those in the next few slides. So next slide, please. How do we go about deciding who can be an author on our paper? Once we've looked at those International Council of Medical Journal Editor guidelines, we have a good idea who could deserve a place as a co-author. The sequence of the co-author should ideally be independent of the relative status or rank of the authors. That's ideally. In practice, I know, of course, that very often the supervisor or the lab head is often the last author, particularly in biological and medical journals. In the physical sciences, that person might be the second author following the student or the postdoc. And in some fields with large numbers of authors, everyone goes alphabetically. So if your surname starts with an A, you will have lots of first author papers, but otherwise, you don't have many first author papers. The expected contributions, roles, and tasks of each potential author should be discussed when you start planning the research project. That's again ideal, doesn't always work in practice. The authorship sequence should be finalized before manuscript writing in an open and professional discussion. That probably works if you have a relatively small group of people contributing to your paper. If you have 10, 15, 20, or even more authors, that's much harder to set down right at that point. I'm a member of a number of international research collaborations. The way that this works in our team usually is that the junior researchers do the research. They start writing up a draft paper with the help of their supervisors and closest collaborators. Once the paper is ready to be shared among the team, it gets shared among the team. And so the student or postdoc will be the first author, their supervisor and close collaborators will be the next few authors, and then the rest of the team, if they contribute usefully and meaningfully, they will be added in alphabetical order. But that's perhaps a quirk of my own field of astrophysics. The authorship sequence can change over time as needed, depending on how much a particular co-author contributes, but only if everyone agrees. After submission, it's still possible, after submission and before publication, that's still possible to change the authorship sequence, but it requires the consent from everyone. And if you want to change the authorship sequence after publication, there are some more issues. You may have to issue a correction to your paper to get this sorted, because once the paper is published, it's part of the permanent record and can no longer be changed. Next slide, please. If you're not an author, but you still contributed and helped with a paper, you will be a contributor and you can be added to the acknowledgement section. This applies to people who have contributed intellectually, ideas or writing, practically, conducting research or data analysis, or financially. I would say if you've contributed only financially, you should be acknowledged, but you cannot be a co-author because you've not contributed intellectually. Any researcher who has contributed to the research but does not meet all of the 4 ICMJE criteria for authorship should be listed in the acknowledgement section, and you should always include your funding agency. Next slide, please. Certain things you should not do. Should not add to your acknowledgements. Contributed not related to the research, including personal encouragement by your friends or your parents. Funding without intellectual contributions by the department head, for instance, if it has nothing to do. The department just provided an office or a desk for you. And general help, for instance, from administrators or laboratory managers. You should also not generally include acknowledgements to anonymous editors or peer reviewers. I've added here with some exceptions. It is acceptable to thank the anonymous reviewers if they really helped significantly to improve your paper. I actually ran into this earlier this week. I had a paper accepted in a journal in my field, and I got an email. I got the proofs of the paper just before publication, and the editor asked me, "Oh, do you want to add an acknowledgement to the editorial team?" I said, "Look, later this week I will be holding a webinar about research ethics, and I'm arguing that this should not be done. So no, I'm not doing it." I don't know if the editor still likes me, but I'm just following the research ethics I'm telling you here about. The reason that you don't do this is if you tend to acknowledge reviewers or editors, they might look at your paper more favorably. And so they might be biased in their decision as to whether or not to accept your paper. And that violates the objectivity clause. Next slide, please. So here are a number of tips. Act with integrity, be accountable for the scientific and social impact of your paper. obey the authorship guidelines, resolve any disputes amongst yourselves. Don't let it go to some ombudsman. People offering significant contributions should make sure they receive due credit, either as an author or in the acknowledgement. And if you've not contributed, then don't claim undue credit, but that seems to make sense. Next one, please. We talked about conflicts of interest. I'd like to spend a few slides on talking about conflicts of interest because they can actually be quite serious. Conflicts of interest arises whenever a researcher's objectives are biased by some secondary interest. Ideally, you do science, you do your research driven purely by intellectual curiosity. However, if you have secondary interests, such as financial, but could also be non-financial, that could bias your results, and that is a clear conflict of interest. It mostly occurs when the researcher or their employer has a financial, commercial, legal, or professional relationship with other organizations or with the people working with them. That could also be like a social conflict of interest. For instance, you would, as an editor, I would not send a submission by a certain author to another researcher at the same institution or to his mother, right? Because there are clear conflicts of interest there. The point is we try to be as objective as possible and remove any conflicts. You can see at the bottom here, potential conflicts of interest in relation to manuscripts could include consultancies, employer, advocacy groups, grants, fees and honoraria, patents, royalties, stocks or share ownership. So many of these have to do with vested interests, financial or otherwise. Next slide, please. You have to declare your conflicts of interests. All funding sources should be in your acknowledgements. That's good practice anyway. Any potential conflict of interest should be declared in the cover letter to the journal. Don't just submit, add a cover letter to the journal and explain the situation, the environment in which you did your research, and it has an impact on the research outcomes. If an employer may have any financial interests or conflict with the subject matter or materials in your manuscript, it needs to be mentioned in that cover letter as well. The cover letter is very important. And some journals require a disclosure statement in the text of the manuscript, and Nature and Science and the top journals also of other publishers require such a statement. Now, on my next slide, there are some headings of, can we go to the next slide, please? Oh, here are some headings from a few years ago now, actually, of various publications, and you can see, the tobacco industry was an issue there, research criticizing industry, someone donating financial assets, drug companies, pharmaceutical companies funding research. All of those could be conflicts of interest, and they all have to be declared at the point of submission of your manuscript. Next slide, please. So how do we avoid conflicts of interest? There's a whole lot of things here, but it comes down to acting with integrity and being objective. Researchers need to ensure that they do research for the sake of doing research without biases. Editors need to select reviewers without competing interests. They also should protect reviewer identities. When you submit a paper to a journal, it will most likely be, it will almost certainly be anonymous. You will not know who your reviewers are. Sometimes the reviewers will not know who you as authors are. That's double blind peer review. In many cases, we have single blind peer review where the author doesn't know the reviewers, but the reviewers do know the authors. Funders should allow researchers to work independently. That's particularly important when we talk about the tobacco industry or pharmaceutical industry or things like that, right? You don't want to be biased by that, by their interests. And research supervisors should carefully oversee any potential conflict of interest between researchers and their funding organization. So there is a role to play here also by the academic. Next slide, please. There's a couple of other things I would like to talk about in terms of research misconduct. And an important one here is the submission of your work either at the same time to another journal, pretty much unchanged. That's dual submission. And that can lead to dual publication if both articles are eventually accepted, or publishing more than one manuscript sharing essentially the same content, that's duplicate or multiple publications, is also unethical. Why is it unethical? Oh, that's my next slide, actually. Next slide, please. It's a waste of time of peer reviewers and editors. There are only so many people in the community, and if you send the same paper to too many people, it's a waste of their time. It wastes, therefore, journal resources. It leads to flawed analysis of the literature because you've got duplicate content. It distorts the academic reward system. It infringes on copyright because most likely you will transfer the copyright of at least one of those two papers to a publisher. It inflates the scientific literature without adding anything to it. So all of these things are bad and should be avoided. So my next slide talks about do's and don'ts. Next slide, please. Yeah. So researchers should not replicate content from any of their other publications without attribution. That's the self-plagiarism aspect. They should not offer preliminary reports about published papers to anyone without the journal's permission. The only exception here are that most journals allow you to post preprint versions of your work on dedicated repositories or preprint servers, bioRxiv or arXiv or some of those repositories. You should always cite the original source when quoting data. And sometimes that means you have to go from one journal to the next, to the next, to the next, because very often people just cite the most recent paper, which may not be the original source. So be mindful of that. If a single data set is used to write more than one manuscript, it must be ensured that each manuscript addresses separate and important questions. That's the idea of the salami slicing I talked about. You cross-reference the manuscript, you refer to the other manuscripts that address the same data set. You should inform the journal editors, either in the cover letter, as it says here, or you make sure that everything is well cross-referenced in the paper itself. And so the issue is here to be completely transparent about what you've done with the data and that you're doing it with integrity rather than as a salami slicing exercise. Next slide, please. There are a few exceptions as regards duplicate publication, in which publishers might agree to publish already published content. Nevertheless, even if it's allowed, you should get permission from the copyright holders to do so. You should get approval from the editor of the journal in which the paper was first published, as well as the editor of the journal in which it will be republished. And you should acknowledge the source of your republication by providing the full citation of the first publication. Again, that's for transparency reasons. So when can we republish papers? A follow-up on a preliminary paper, for instance, an abstract or poster or a conference presentation, which is not a full paper, but just a summary of the work or preliminary version of it. A paper with a list of guidelines prepared by professional societies or government agencies. A paper that reanalyzes or reinterprets the findings of the study for a different audience or in a different language. That's number 4. I've done that myself. I used to work, as you could see from my biography, for about 8.5 years in China. I used to write a number of fairly high-level articles in English that were then translated for a Chinese publication. And that was all fine because it was done completely transparently with the consent of both editors involved. And then I mentioned already these preprint servers. You can post a preprint that's often the paper as it is just at the time of acceptance without the journal having gone through the copy editing and the formatting and the layouting. You can post your paper. Most publishers and journals allow you to post your paper in these archive repositories. Next slide, please. We mentioned salami slicing a number of times. That's the slicing of research that would form a meaningful single paper into several different papers. It's unethical. It could help boosting the citation count and build a resume of the researcher. It's unethical because publishing repetitive information is a waste of resources and does not really add anything. It makes it difficult for readers to understand the big picture, and readers may misinterpret the results of any given paper without seeing the full overview. You can do it. You can split up a data set into smaller data set if your data set is enormous. And here are some examples: large clinical trials, epidemiological studies. That's quite appropriate at the moment, of course, with COVID-19, or astronomical surveys. Next slide, please. What happens sometimes is, and we mentioned this earlier, is so-called citation manipulation. Excessive citations by an author to his or her own publications, papers from a selected journal or another researcher's work without any contribution to the scholar's work, but with the only purpose of increasing the number of citations, should not be done. A number of years ago, I wrote an article and I wanted a senior co-author from another country to contribute as an author, and he actually did that very well. But he also said, oh, by the way, can you add the following 9 papers to your list of references? And they were all by him as first author. And so I was a fairly junior researcher at the time, and I managed to trim that down from 9 to about 5 citations, which were all relevant. But that was an instance of excessive citations that I didn't feel comfortable about. Reviewers or journals requiring authors to cite their publications in the manuscript is known as coercive citation manipulation. I gave you an example about that earlier in the presentation. Sometimes more than one journal, they try to mutually boost the number of citations to papers in their journals to increase their impact factors. And this is referred to as a citation manipulation cartel. And again, that's highly, if you're caught by Clarivate Analytics, which runs the journal impact factors, if you're caught doing that, you will be scrapped from the journal impact factors for a number of years. So that's quite a significant penalty, because that means that many researchers will no longer want to publish in your journal. So any author, journal, or reviewer attempting to increase their citation counts artificially without good reasons is violating publication ethics. Next slide, please. Now, let's talk briefly, and there's a lot of text on this slide, about copyright infringement. Copyright is a legal exclusive right given to the creator of an idea or work to reproduce it. So if you've written your paper, you are at that point the copyright holder. It's intellectual property. Now, that copyright may be transferred to the publisher, depending on the journal you're publishing in. Most of the time, this happens in subscription-based, for subscription-based journals. In open access journals, you often get to keep the copyright yourself. In my fields, quite a few of the subscription-based journals also now allow you to keep the copyright yourself. If your work can be shared, it's often shared under a Creative Commons license. Just like on Wikipedia, most pictures are Creative Commons licensed, so it can be freely reused. Sometimes with some catch. It's not always completely free, but sometimes it's only for non-commercial reuse. If you have, however, already transferred the copyright of your paper to a publisher, you cannot add such a license to your work. And of course, if you would like to include third-party content in your manuscript, you need to get a copyright permission from the owner of that third party. And we can think here of, for instance, figures or images that were published elsewhere and which are not available under any Creative Commons license. You have to obtain the copyright clearance to include that in your own work. Next slide, please. So the final few slides of my part of the presentation, I'd like to talk about how to avoid ethical dilemmas. So let's go next to the next slide. Here's the checklist for you as author. This is more or less a summary of what we've been talking about. Make sure your work is original and not plagiarized. You've submitted it only to one journal, not to multiple journals. You have all the permissions, copyright clearance, for instance, for figures and data. All authors mentioned have contributed, so they abide by the authorship guidelines, and there are no conflicts of interest. Next slide. You need to get consent. If you use patients, you need to get consent from everyone to use sensitive and confidential data in your manuscript. You also need to obtain permission for reuse of figures, tables, images, anything you've not produced yourselves. And you must get written consent by the author, and copies of the consent or similar evidence must be provided to the journal upon request. You don't have to add it to your cover letter, but if the journal asks for it, you have to have it available. Next, please. So the bottom line, know the rules, learn from the mistakes other people made and don't make them yourself. Take steps to avoid and resolve conflicts. Know your rights, but also your responsibilities, and learn to recognize the most common ethical mistakes so you don't fall into those traps yourselves. Next, please. If you are a research supervisor, next, please. Can we have the next? Yeah, thank you. Here are some things you can do to make sure that your team works with integrity. Ensure that all researchers understand all the policies that they need to meet. Often your university or your research institution will have a set of policies about doing research. We have them at my institution. We have them pinned up in our photocopier room, for instance. Encourage transparency wherever research is conducted. Ensure that there is sufficient supervision in the entire pathway of doing research, from data collection all the way to publication. Establish an unbiased Office of Research Integrity. Many universities have such an office, or there might be one within your state or nationally. Implement operational rigor in every research process to sustain consistency and accountability. Be a careful researcher and keep good records. Educate and train all members to undertake accurate and timely documentation of their work. So this is for supervisors. There have been a few cases recently of ethics violations. I have a few examples. On my next slide, please. And then the other one, the next one. Here is, and I have to read my notes. This retraction notice, this is from the journal Cell. The notice states that the first author had repeatedly misrepresented and altered the primary data, because of which the key research findings could not be replicated in follow-up experiments conducted by the corresponding author and his team. Then the authors decided to retract the paper, but the first author did not agree, and he did not sign the retraction notice. The Office of Research Integrity in the United States then issued a statement to qualify this as well. So this is very serious, right? Because this is a national office that, in essence, chastises the researchers for doing something wrong. Next slide, please. This paper is from Nature. It was retracted, received a lot of comments on PubPeer, which is a platform where you can comment on published papers. It's like a post-publication peer review, because of issues with almost all figures represented. The retraction notice said the following: the authors are retracting this paper to correct the scientific literature due to issues with figure presentation and underlying data. The authors cannot confirm at present the results in the affected figures, and thus would wish to retract the paper. This sounds very nice. They probably agonized over this text, because this is very serious again. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier on in the presentation that some authors faked their peer reviews, and this is one example of that from a website called Retraction Watch, which is well worth following, actually, retractionwatch.com. where some authors decided to suggest possible peer reviewers to journal editors, and they gave them names and email addresses. The names were genuine, the email addresses were fake. They actually went back to the original author. So the author submitted their paper, his suggested peer reviewers were selected as peer reviewers. A few days later, he got invitations by email from the editor to review his own paper. Of course, the editor did not realize that this happened. And very soon afterwards, of course, all those reviews came back very positively and the papers were published. A year ago, 2 years ago, a number of publishers retracted more than 100 such papers because, well, and that of course leaves a very bad stain on your reputation. Next slide, please. Here is an example of when this happened in about 2010 here. The IEEE, that's an Electronics Engineering Society, Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, retracted several thousand conference abstracts violating their guidelines. Most of them, it says here, were submitted by Chinese authors, unfortunately. And the obvious reason was that conference abstracts are usually, the peer review of them is usually less rigorous than that of actual peer-reviewed papers. The statement issued by the IEEE said, after careful and considered review of the contents of this paper by a duly constituted expert committee, this paper has been found to be in violation of the IEEE's publication principles. That was quite a big coup, more than, well, several thousand such papers. That's the end of my part of the presentation, but we're not quite there yet. We're going to Dr. Alam now for the next few slides. Thank you for listening to me.
Okay, thank you very much. And hello everybody for, well, from the UK. It's now over here 2:46 in the afternoon. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are. So I will hopefully be doing my part within 10 minutes. Let's see if I manage to do that. So I'm going to give the publisher's perspective on publication ethics. I think Richard went through a lot of those topics quite comprehensively. So I'm just really going to focus on what, as publishers, what our responsibilities are regarding these types of issues. Specifically, I'm going to talk about Taylor & Francis because that's obviously where I'm based. I'm the Director of Publishing Ethics and Integrity. Taylor & Francis is one of the largest scholarly publishers. We've been around for a long time. Our origins go back to about 1798. And over the years, the publisher has evolved a lot and now publishes content in humanities and social sciences, as well as medicine, science and technology. We currently have over 2,500 journals and over 110,000 books. We have our own journals that we publish with under Taylor & Francis' name, but we also publish under some other imprints such as Routledge, Dove Press, Cogent, CRC Press, and F1000 Research. So when it comes to publication ethics issues, specifically at Taylor & Francis journals, I've listed here some of the most common issues that we see. This is not an exhaustive list, but there are other things that I haven't actually added here today because I really wanted to focus on showing the frequency with which we actually come across these issues across different journals in many different disciplines. Richard has already mentioned a lot of these. And what I would want to point out is that as publishers, we have a responsibility to perform an investigation when any of these sorts of concerns come up. It's not just us that will do this investigation. Any investigation of this type will involve several people. So obviously there's a journal editor, and we are on hand to support the journal editor to conduct any necessary investigations. So how it's set up at Taylor & Francis is that each journal will have an in-house editorial contact point. That person is responsible for supporting the editor with developing and managing the journal, but also if there are ethics concerns that come in, the in-house editorial contact will actually navigate that ethics concern through the several parties that need to be involved. So depending on the complexity of the case, that person would inform the journal editor that there's a concern that's been raised, let's say after publication, let's use that as an example. And then if it's quite complex, they will also come to me and my team, so we're the Publication Ethics and Integrity team, to get our advice so that collectively we can decide on what are the appropriate steps to take. What do we need to ask the authors or the institution? What information do we require? How are we going to ask this? We need to ensure that we're following best practices and processes. So Richard mentioned earlier on in his talk that publishers also collaborate together. And that's very true. It's important that we do that because as publishers, we want to make sure that we are following consistent processes in terms of conducting investigations when it comes to publication ethics issues. And one of the key guiding bodies that we have is the Committee of Publication Ethics, or COPE, which you may have heard of. Depending on the complexity of the case, we may also need to involve the legal team sometimes. So it can be quite complex, but we have a very solemn duty, really, to investigate these. So one of the things I wanted to point out is regarding authorship. And Richard showed a really good slide earlier on about how to decide who's being an author and how to set up agreements, an authorship order, and that sort of thing. And I really like that slide, and I encourage you to study that, because one of the most common things we see are authorship disputes. So this could be where someone has come to us and said, oh, I should have been an author on this paper. Or they come and say, actually, I was acknowledged, but I should have been an author. Or I don't like that I'm author number 3, I should be author number 1. It can be anything like that. Sometimes it's also that an author says, I want to step down. I want to withdraw from being an author on this paper. Now, the problem with this is that as publishers, we can't resolve this by ourselves. We can't decide. We can't take one person's word against another. We have to say to the authors, you need to resolve this amongst yourselves. You need to come to a consensus, and when you come to a consensus, you tell us, and then we will proceed. And that's because we simply don't have the evidence one way or another to decide who should be an author. That's up to the authors and also up to the institutions. So when there's an authorship dispute, if it's come up before publication, what we would do is we actually stop all processes. So if the paper is going through peer review, we will actually stop that. Or if it's already been accepted, it's going through typesetting, again, we stop that. And that's because we know there's a problem associated. So we say to the authors, we've had to stop the processes. You come to a consensus amongst yourselves about the authorship issue. Typically, the institution has to be involved. Sometimes we ourselves will inform the institution and say, please resolve this. And then we can say to the authors that when you have a consensus, come back to us, everyone, not just the complainant, not just the corresponding author, but all of the listed authors have to confirm to us that they agree to the new author list and the authorship order. And we depend on the corresponding author to coordinate that type of response. So once we have evidence that there is a consensus, then we can proceed. If it's taking a long time and it hasn't been published yet, then sometimes we would say to the author, please withdraw your manuscript while you actually come to a consensus. So that's something I wanted to point out to you today. Another thing I wanted to point out is acknowledgements. And this is because often it's overlooked by authors that it's actually quite important to notify and obtain permission from anyone that you do choose to name in the acknowledgement section. So as Richard was pointing out, that anyone who has contributed in any way should be acknowledged. So contributed intellectually, I should say. So they should be acknowledged, and ideally you want to acknowledge them by name. So let's say I wrote a paper and I had a useful discussion with Richard about it, so I wanted to put his name in the acknowledgement section. I would actually have to first of all inform him that that's what I'm doing. And ideally I need to show him the paper. I need to show him this is what I've written and this is how I'm acknowledging you. Because first of all, he has the right to say, actually, please don't put my name in there. Or he could say, actually, I disagree with this content. So the person who's being named there should be shown the paper and should be notified that you are acknowledging them. It's such a simple thing to do. It can avoid you problems down the line, because what happens is if the paper gets published and the person didn't want to have their name included, there can be some legal problems as well later on. Sometimes we come across issues that maybe it's personal reason, but it could also be a political reason. We have to think about sometimes a sensitive political nature between countries. But also the person being acknowledged sometimes actually comes back and says, I should actually be an author. I was involved heavily because I thought I was going to be an author. So then there's an authorship dispute. So a very simple action on the for authors to do is, if you're acknowledging anyone by name, please let them know that that's what you're doing, show them the paper, and actually get them to agree to be acknowledged in the way that you are. And I wanted to demonstrate this with an example. This is a real example that happened recently at Taylor & Francis, but it's one of many. So we had a paper that was published in a journal. The acknowledgements section mentioned several people. And after publication, one of those people acknowledged, contacted the editor and said, please remove my name. And she explained that while the research was being conducted and while the paper was being put together, she agreed with the content. But by the time the paper had gone through review and revision and it was finalized, it had changed quite a lot. And she actually fundamentally disagreed with the content. So she explained to the editor that it was about the political correctness of it. The way that the argument was redrafted since she was involved was, in her opinion, ethically wrong. And so she told the author that I actually don't agree with this content, but the author still listed her name under the acknowledgements. So she was very upset about that because she said that it was misrepresenting her views on this. By being acknowledged in the paper by name, it gave the impression she was agreeing with the content. And that's why it's important to sort of just keep that in mind with the people who are being acknowledged. So when there are issues that arise on content that we have already published, we as publishers have to take certain steps to resolve that in the best possible way. There's three main things we can do. So the first is a correction article. So this is where there's a minor error that has been noticed. It might be the authors who noticed it, it might be the editor, it might be the reader, it might be, Richard mentioned PubPeer earlier on, there's a lot of conversation, discussions that go on places like PubPeer. If it's minor in nature, and that could be something like a mislabeling of a figure or something like that, which doesn't affect the overall conclusions, doesn't actually harm the integrity of the content, then we would need to issue a correction notice. And that's because we can't make silent changes. As a publisher, we have a responsibility towards permanency of content. And so if we're correcting anything that is considered to be important, ethically important, then we would have to post a permanent notice attached to the article to say this correction was made. And that's because someone might have downloaded an earlier version that didn't have that correction. So we want to make sure that whoever sees the latest version will always see that there is a correction associated with it, and that notice is permanently attached to the article, and it's also sent out to various indexes as well. The other thing is the expression of concern, and this is something we don't want to do often because it's, again, a permanent notice, and it's something we have to consider when there is a major concern. It might be to do with the research ethics, it might be to do with claims about misconduct or image manipulation, but something that is actually fairly major in nature. But it could be the investigation is taking a long time, and there could be concerns that if we don't say anything, then it's actually going to cause harm to the readership or to the public. So we would have to kind of consider, is it time for us to put a notice on the paper to say there is a concern regarding this? If we were to do that, again, it's a permanent notice, so we need to do that carefully. And we would always do that after having attempted at least to have a discussion with the authors and the institution, so the author will be aware that this is happening. And then the final thing is a retraction. So the retraction is where the content is fundamentally flawed. It's either to do with the integrity or there's some error that actually renders the article no longer valid. The retraction, it's important to note the retraction can be done by authors. So the authors can actually themselves be noticing an error and saying, we are retracting the article. That's considered very good scholarly behavior because authors are ultimately responsible for their content, not just during the submission and publication process, but also afterwards. But where there are concerns raised, we would always approach in liaison with the journal editor, we would approach the authors to ask for information depending on what the concerns are. Sometimes we ask for the data, especially if it's to do with concerns around image manipulation. We would ask for the original images as well. If authors or their institutions, because our next step will be if the authors don't respond, we go to the institution. If neither of them are responding to us, then we might still take action, because we can't have it that the lack of response leads to no action on a paper. So we have to weigh that up quite carefully. And that's where I mentioned earlier on, sometimes we do need to take legal advice as well. So these are all very serious things, they're all permanent notices, but what I want to point out is none of these steps are done to punish authors. It's not done to shame authors or shame institutions or anything like that. The sole purpose of these types of notices is to ensure that the scholarly record is correct and to ensure its integrity. And that's why we will approach authors and ask for their opinion on any concerns raised as well. So Richard showed some examples of some retraction notices. This is the one example from Taylor and Francis Journal. So in the first red box, you can see who is retracting the article. So we will always try to say at the beginning, who is retracting it? Is it the editor and the publisher, or is it also the author? In this example, it's all three. It's the editor, authors, and publisher. And the next thing you'll see, which is in the red box, is why. So we have to give a reason why we are retracting the article. And here it's really that the authors noticed that there was a coding error at the data analysis stage. So after publication, it's the authors who actually brought this to the attention of the journal editor and the publisher immediately. That's very good scholarly behavior. And so we want to give credit to the authors here, which is why it's explicitly stated in the retraction note. And so it's also clear going forwards why this retraction took place. And just finally, before I round off, when it comes to publication ethics, who is responsible? We get asked that question sometimes, and really it's all of us. It's all of us within the research publishing ecosystem. So with authors, they're responsible for ensuring the integrity of the contents, both before and after publication, to follow up on any questions that come across to them based on their published content. The institutions at which the research is being conducted, because they're the ones approving the study and the research is being done on their watch. Editors of journals, obviously, they're responsible for ensuring the integrity of the content they're publishing and therefore following up with any concerns. Reviewers who should be reviewing with due diligence, like Richard said earlier on, not just to give one line to say, yes, this is great, or no, this is awful, but to really critically review an article. And publishers, because we're publishing this content, we're disseminating this content, so we're also responsible for ensuring the integrity. So we all play our role, and it's important that we all try and resolve this together, which is why it's a pleasure to be on a call like this today with you all. But I will.
Right, I think with this we will conclude our webinar today. Thank you, Professor Digris and Dr. Alam, for conducting an insightful session today. Our attendees have indeed gained a lot of critical information. We'd like to thank everybody for attending this session and request you all to fill the feedback survey displayed after you leave the webinar. Your feedback will allow us to evaluate the effectiveness of our webinar. Have a good evening, and thank you all once again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.